Only 31% of young adults 18 to 25 in 10 Western nations feel they're doing enough to avoid climate catastrophe.
What do our young people know and think about the state of our planet? We ask a group of college students in this episode.
When apocalypse looms and you need heroic action from our youth to save the planet, who are you going to call?
Calling. Call a GrowthBuster. Whoa.
Welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast, where we discuss our society's addiction to growth and do our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization. On a full planet, that means it's time we stop expanding the scale of the human enterprise. We're talking about both our numbers and the size of our economy. Of course, that includes exploring ways to shrink our own individual footprints. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth, and chief scientist at the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner, GrowthBusters board member, environmental law and policy wonk, and sustainable energy enthusiast. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org.
All right, before we get into this important conversation, I want to real quickly mention a job opening because this position is about to close. So if you're interested, apply today. It's a part-time job helping us manage the GrowthBusters network and helping us with a new outreach project on college campuses. It's not a lot of hours, but it does require a little bit of passion for the work that we're doing. If you're interested in getting more details, you can find the job posting at GrowthBusters.org. For sure, write to us if you want to express some interest in applying for the position. Podcast at growthbusters.org.
We have a really fantastic conversation with the college students, and it ended up being a long conversation, so we decided to skip our listener feedback segment this time, but we do love hearing from you, so please, if you have something smart and relevant to say, we'd love to hear from you. You can leave us a voicemail message at 719-402-1400. You can always email us at podcast@growthbusters.org, or we oftentimes share comments that are left on our videos at the GrowthBusters YouTube channel or on our GrowthBusters Facebook page. So continue to engage with us.
Yep, we love hearing from you. So because of this good, long conversation with the class, this is probably going to be the longest episode of the GrowthBusters podcast. It's not going to be anywhere near as long as the typical episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, however. And it's going to be, I don't know, Stephanie, what do you think? About 50 times more important and more intelligent.
Yeah, it's a good investment of your listening time.
And there's no law that says you have to listen to it in one sitting. The nice thing about podcasts is when you get to the end of your commute or the end of your workout or the end of cooking dinner, just stop. And the next time you open up the app where you're listening to this podcast, it'll pick right up where you left off. So we intentionally decided not to be too heavy-handed about editing the conversation with these young people that are just so important to the future of the planet. So let's get to the main topic of this episode, Stephanie. Kind of setting the stage for this, there was a survey done in September. A study was published in the British medical journal, The Lancet, that kind of gave us a glimpse of young people's thoughts and feelings about climate change and their assessment of government response to the crisis. They surveyed 10,000 young people between 16 and 25 years of age from 10 countries, almost all Western: Finland, France, Australia, Portugal, Brazil, India, the Philippines, Nigeria, United Kingdom, and the United States. And it was pretty interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, these statistics really kind of blew me away. I know we've talked about this topic a little bit here and there in the last few episodes, but these are some really interesting results of this survey. 83% said people have failed to care for the planet. 75% find the future frightening. 56% believe humanity is doomed.
Wow, that's pretty stunning. Yeah. Over half.
39% are hesitant to have children. More than half feel sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. 65% feel the government response to climate change is failing young people. Only 36% trust governments to act in line with the climate science. Just 31% believe they're personally doing enough to avoid catastrophe.
That's pretty surprising to me.
Yeah. And then there are two fairly new terms that are growing in use, and those are climate anxiety and eco-anxiety.
Well, we thought you'd like to hear directly from our young people, and it just so happens that we got a good offer from Paul Sutton. You may recall Paul guested on episode 62 of our podcast, World Leaders Cop Out, link in the show notes. He's a professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Denver, and he and I were brainstorming and thought it would be valuable to invite one of his classes to join the podcast. So I sat down with his Ecological Economics class in early February. And I was anxious, Stephanie, for you to hear the conversation, and I really want to get your impressions.
Yeah, I was bummed that I couldn't be there in person. I wasn't in Colorado when you went up to Denver, so couldn't participate in the moment, but have really enjoyed listening to all the commentary from these young people. So yeah, looking forward to discussing it after we listen. Yeah,
they're even younger than you.
Yep. Thanks for the reminder.
Starting to feel middle-aged, are you? So here's a conversation with Ecological Economics class at the University of Denver. There are about 14 of us in the room today. We're here because I want to hear from you. I'd like to find out what you know and what you've learned and how you feel about the things that you've been learning, mostly in this class, I think. So first off, were any of you aware that we're in overshoot prior to taking this class?
Yeah, I knew that we were in overshoot and we're using more than we have capable to us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an environmental science major, so pretty much everything we talk about involved with climate change, our involvement with resource extraction is about just we're taking way more than we should.
But everybody now, today, is aware of it and knows what it is? Yeah? Lots of heads nodding. Those of you who found out about it just in the last month, was it a surprise to you?
I don't think it was a surprise because our habits as a human race have been kind of destructive, and the path we're on is kind of leading to negative consequences, so I wasn't surprised about that.
But you knew that?
Yeah.
Okay. So for any of you, was it a surprise to learn that we are being so destructive?
I think it's hard to exist and be a conscious human and have some sort of critical thinking. At this point, we're all in college. I feel like if you haven't thought about consequences, what we're doing, the fact that pavement even exists, I feel like, what are you doing if you haven't thought about that?
This was a very self-selective group. We're all, I think, geography, environmental science majors. So if you're a geography or environmental science major and you don't know about a lot of these trends, you're kind of not paying attention.
My thoughts exactly.
Yeah, good point. But the rest of the world, are you surprised at how ignorant or unenlightened so many people in the world are?
I know I am. I just have certain conversations with people that aren't in this circle of knowing kind of what's going on, and it just blows my mind about how ignorant people can be and kind of in denial mode as well.
Have you had conversations with your parents about the subject?
There are people, especially of their generation, that do acknowledge the issue and can talk about it, but don't really use the language or really understand the full scope of it. But I think there are conversations that have existed for a while just about kind of these issues, how humans are very destructive, and we put ourselves at the top of the pyramid, and they're the generation that is conscious and did that. So I feel like there is some awareness, just not formal language, maybe.
Did any of you, as a result of what you're doing here at the University of Denver, bring up the subject with your folks when you were at home, and was it a complete surprise to them? Anybody run into that? Or did they take exception to the whole notion that we're being so brutal?
I think it's really easy to dismiss it as a generational issue. Also, I have a lot of family in Mexico, and a lot of the times when I bring this to other generation or people my age, they don't necessarily know as much of the information about overshoot or other trends that are going on in the world right now, but they do notice things we can't drink water from the river anymore. Why is that? So as soon as you start bringing up the things that they are noticing, then you can start opening up those conversations. At least that's been my experience.
For me, I feel like the conversation happens over a large span of time. In high school, I was in an environmental science academy. So every kind of new year, new unit we were learning, I'd discuss with my parents about, new waves of sustainability and things about that. And so it kind of happened in a long scope. And I think they learned a lot through me about that. But before then, they hadn't really put much thought into it. And that's just simply because it's not on the forefront of a lot of people's minds when they're going about their day-to-day basis or reading the news. It's not right there in front of them.
Well, especially they're the generation that really pushed reduce, reuse, recycle and did focus on creating a lot of green spaces. And so when you get into the nuance of our daily lifestyles and how much the things we don't even think about actually is contributing to this, talking about specific conversations I've had with my mom, she doesn't really want to think about it because she feels like she's contributed a lot and a lot of thought and a lot of effort to her personal footprint. But it's the things that car usage, planes, and things like that where you just can't really imagine your life without them at this point.
So I'd like to get, in your words, a good definition of overshoot. Who would care to just give us a quick elevator definition?
Using too many of one resource without letting it replenish itself.
I feel like I relate it specifically back to our carbon footprint and the overshoot date. And it's just kind of the I feel community and individual usage of resources unsustainably for future generations and for current people on the planet too.
Is there anyone here in the room who really doubts that we are in overshoot?
I would ask specifically where and in what industries. I think it's good to prioritize problems so that we can better find solutions to it because, these issues of climate change are so broad and interconnected, it can be very hard where to start and where to maybe limit growth or where we can really alter what we've been continually doing. But I would first ask, okay, where do we start and what best to devote our attention, time, our money, certainly, first and foremost, and then go from there.
Also, I can add, we should also focus on the location or the region in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think every country is overshooting on every consumption product, but Western countries has been doing it since they had the industrialization process way before some other countries. And for example, I'm from Turkey originally. So in my country, ethically, it's not, it's a very problematic issue if you overconsume something. Socially, it's not nice to eat too much or spend too much or, waste, to produce waste too much.
Wow, that's a lot different than the
U.S.
U.S.
That's a lot different. Yeah, when I first moved here, I was super surprised that nobody's saving anything. Everybody's, simple things like leaving the lights on, leaving the water on for a long time. They're not even paying attention to this. When I'm saying they, every people I've seen here and all the Turkish people who lives here also gets into their track. They behave like that in time. And I'm from the previous generation. I'm a little older than much older than my peers here. So I can say that they're not aware of most of the things about climate change or global warming. And we had a lot of wildfires in Turkey last summer. Everybody thought they were terrorist attacks at the same time in 90 different places. I tried to explain that it's not even that. It should be because of overheating. So every time I try to talk about this, they have some awareness, but they don't really understand how important and severe our situation is. My age people in their 30s, 40s. So that's, one of the reasons I came back to school to have my PhD is that actually I stopped working. I'm a city planner, urban planner. I stopped working and I decided to go back to academia and become a teacher or a researcher and do something about this. And now I'm teaching my kids. And so that will be my contribution.
Now, I heard climate change mentioned, and overshoot is a much broader category. Disruption of the climate is certainly one of the biggest pieces of evidence and one of the biggest effects of our overshoot, but you guys are also looking into other elements of humankind's footprint on the planet, right? Fertile soil, depletion, fresh water, crises, toxification. What else? What are some of the other negative impacts of our presence and the way we're organized and acting today?
Materialistic consumptions, and also where our waste actually ends up in the oceans, in landfills, especially if they're, and since most of them are not biodegradable.
Yep, good point, Gray, thanks. Cody, were you going to say something?
I was going to say the most surprising, and we talked about this extensively, is the fishing industry. I mean, just the depletion of fish stocks over the years and the mismanagement between countries. I mean, it's just shocking just how many species we've depleted, and now we are shifting to more vulnerable, smaller, maybe not as protein dense or even as healthy of fish just because of this. And fishing law just varies globally so much with how much you can catch and what species and size, and we can't seem to agree on it. And that's fish as a protein, I mean, is a primary protein in many countries, and that's just alarming just to hear that without some sort of animal protein, I mean, you could see vast health implications even over long periods of time in the not too distant future, really. And yeah, that was just shocking to just talk about. And we did talk about it quite extensively, and just to see the numbers and the stats and everything. And it's happening all over. Every ocean pretty much is just seeing this.
Well, and like continuing even just like the food industry in general,
Sure.
like deforestation, habitat loss, then into loss of biodiversity. And the fact that we do produce enough food to feed everybody on the planet, and it's just that mismanaged, that we have that much food waste. It's pretty despicable. And like, so when people often will talk about like population growth as being unsustainable, I have a hard time talking about that, because it's not about population at this point, because we do have the resources to provide for the population. It's about the mismanagement of the resources by specifically Western powers.
Some of you got the assignment to learn a little bit more about limits to growth and report back to the class. Who was involved in the limits to growth group? What was notable about the research that you did?
How long ago this study occurred? I think it was the 70s, and they're making some pretty harsh claims about the future of humanity, and they didn't really get respected by that many people or widely adopted. There was kind of an ongoing debate and never really settled into any impacts. It kind of was more just like a signal alarm. But now 50 years later, we're looking at the trends that they predicted, and a lot of them have come true to surprising accuracy. So I was just really impressed by that.
Yeah, 50 years ago that study was published. What else?
That we can still change our trajectory, because I originally thought before Limits to Growth that it was probably too late to shift it to the point where humanity can actually survive on Earth.
I mean, one of the things that I found really interesting about my research was the inter-academia and different field clashes that there were with the studies. Like in 2018, a Nobel laureate won a prize saying that the limits of growth theory was not serious enough and completely dismissed critical aspects. Like he said that agriculture only made 3% of the GDP, so we wouldn't really be impacted anyway. So I think that just a lot of the claims and misinformation that exists in other fields like economics is important to account for, because they have the power to dismiss what the scientists are saying in our governments and in our systems, really.
So this is an economics class. Why is it in your track? Why do you think it's important to be studying ecological economics?
We've discussed it. Economics is the prevalent school of thought, especially social science, that is used in policy and kind of how Washington and how all of these kind of larger scale systems operate under this perspective of economy and kind of this classic consumers and producers. And I think that understanding the basis of that belief and then deconstructing it and hyper-criticizing it just because of how impactful it is why it's in our course.
Well, even at the basic level, like traditional economics, supply and demand, like doesn't even take into account what creates supply, which are resources. And so like you can't just decide supply without considering the person supplying it, which is the earth. It's just silly.
Even ecological economics is not new to us. And yet for 50 years, we've been able to really ignore the limits to growth study, seriously ignore it. How and why has that study been just a footnote in human history so far?
I'll take a shot. I think it's because no one wants to fall behind in the competition of globalization. And it's just kind of like how the whole system works is economics, essentially.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of like making any changes, especially why this study has been ignored, is because, at least for right now, the benefits economically in terms of like following these suggestions do not outweigh the money that can be made when you ignore them entirely. Because like, if we just really think about it, in terms of global economy and just like countries in general, the bottom line is making money. And whatever way you can maximize that without taking a large risk, that's what countries will do.
And they've been able to kind of like establish that importance by disguising it as like, oh, we're providing for humans and we're providing like for the general public, like this is the only system that will get people fed, get people housed, get people clothed. When in reality, people aren't fed, people aren't housed, people aren't clothed. It's not working. And so like we're seeing it fall apart on a socioeconomic scale as well. So there are so many failures, not only environmentally, but the powers that be and the people that are controlling the system are the people benefiting, are the ones pushing the propaganda to keep it afloat.
Well, Christian, I'm glad you brought up making money. You know, even if you're not really intent on amassing obscene amounts of wealth, everybody wants some economic security, right? So most of you are young enough that you're going to get your degree and go off and do something in the world. What are your thoughts about that? Are you challenged in coming up with a career plan, a life plan that is consistent with what you know about limits to growth and overshoot?
I actually really wanted to quickly say that I'm actually hoping to get my master's in economics. And one of the things that I think that, going back to the last question, that a lot of economists dismiss limits to growth is because this is a baby compared to like the old, how long and established Adam Smith has been in our economic models. So I think that for a lot of them too, even though the studies are proven time and time again, limits to growth is still fairly new and with regards to the school of thought. And that also leads to this question, which is how does like our behaviors now and maybe changing our traditions or the traditions that have long been established compared to where we're going? If that makes sense. I lost my train of thought in the middle of there, but I was going somewhere.
It was a question about how
we live our lifestyle. So there's also like the notion of how our parents told us and generations before of us, and like how economists for generations have been teaching economists to think about the economy versus us who are in a new landscape are going about our lifestyles and the choices that we're making, and how limits of growth also kind of mirrors that in the economic landscape, if that makes sense. That's the metaphor I was trying to draw.
We need more economists with critical thinking skills like that, huh? Yeah, Tim?
I was going to say, I was having a conversation with like a PhD student last week, and his friend just finished his like postdoctoral work in like a biology lab on campus. And he's been in academia for 8 years maybe. And he got a job with an environmental consultancy with an oil and gas company because he needed to pay off his student loans.
That's where the money is.
That's the whole problem, is that we're in the system where we spend so much money on school, and then when we get out, we can't even afford to have a job which we want because all the money that we need comes from these massive corporations which are not helping solve the problem. And it's just this perpetual cycle of it's not what we want.
Damn, are you telling me you're going to have to sell out?
Yeah.
I lost my ecological conscience when I graduated from college. I completely forgot what I had learned about conservation and the importance of nature and focused only on getting a good job, getting good pay, getting married, being a good provider. For 20 years, I just completely ignored the needs of Mother Earth. So I can understand how that the world kind of works against itself in that department.
Well, it's funny, like when I was choosing to do environmental science and going here and telling all my family members about it, like the immediate response is like, oh, like tree hugger, liberal college student, like, oh, don't worry, when you get older, like you'll grow out of it. And I'll talk about these things and these really important things. Now that I get like further and further into my education, I know more and more, I have more and more conversations about it with everybody, and still the response is the same, and it is so dismissive, but yet these are the same people that were like, oh, you're 18, choose a path, like, pick something that's important to you, and I'm like, this is really important to me, and then they're dismissing it and saying, like, you're gonna sell out because this is just a society that we live in, and I'm so determined to not fall into that trap.
I'm pretty sure you're going to be a hedge fund manager.
Vigorous for that, for sure.
Anybody else have any thoughts about that? How is this going to affect your life? What do you think your life is going to be like? What's the future hold for you?
Yeah, I think for me, my dad grew up with no money, so his whole life was about capitalizing on GDP growth as much as possible. And I think that kind of set me up from a young age to say, okay, this is not what I want to be doing. Because he has a big heart, and I think it kind of just sucked the soul right out of him. And he recently started working for a company that works with Chevron and big oil, and he quit his job. But I think that was kind of like a turning point for me where I was like, okay, I can't really be passive in my family. I have to do something where I can pay for my health insurance and food, but something that's meaningful and is working towards changing things, even if other people don't believe that we can.
It's hard because I think the current statistic is only 30% of people find work in their field. And I've been on unemployment for the last 3 months, and I have a person who's supposed to help me find a job. And he brought up a map of jobs in environmental science, and I have a minor in GIS. And there was only 3 states where the job market had grown by 6% in this field. And so I currently have to relocate to Vermont or Virginia to find a job that will actually use my field.
And I'm hoping that this is going to change because, so I feel like the University of Denver is a really good model for how the real world looks with ratio business people to us. And so a lot of my friends are in the business school, and we are like-minded in terms of politics. We do talk about climate change. They're fully on board with that. And I think a lot of people in our generation are. I think that's a very popular belief to have, and understanding that we are very much the cause of it, and these industries are very much the issue, and knowing that it is corporations, but at the same time, we will work for these corporations one day. And it's I will start to have these conversations, and my friends will kind of dismiss it or get mad that I'm arguing with them. But then it just kind of reveals sometimes that they won't keep these beliefs maybe going forward, and that the things that they're learning in their classes, while they want to be on board with the popular politics, it's hard when that's not how the economic system is running and our society is running. And so I don't know, I'm hoping that we'll stay friends and we'll have dinner parties and I'll change their mind, and then they're gonna go to their meetings and present great ideas. Or maybe I'll just work for them.
I think this new generation, as they get educated about the climate change and the limits to growth and economic growth is not working anymore, maybe at the beginning they might suffer, but as they grow in their careers, as they have a say, they will change things. So education is so important. The new coming generations should be educated when they're little, so that when they have the power to change something, they will do it in the right way. That's what I think. Because now you might feel like you're really desperate, or you might feel like you don't have too much hope. But as soon as you start working, maybe during your early career, you might go with the wind, but as long as you grow, get matured up, and get the power, you'll change things with all these things you know. So I'm hopeful.
I also think that we're talking a lot about how corporations are the cause of a lot of our problems. And I think it's definitely an ethical question of whether to sell out after college, but it's really hard to change the system from the outside in. So I think that even having these jobs within these corporations, we can make a change from internally from those corporations that might have a bigger impact than us trying to like break at them from the outside.
Yeah, you're the future CEOs of
and
some of these companies.
Also politicians.
Yeah. We need you in the U.S. Senate today.
Oh, no. No, thank you.
Is it impossible today to ignore the fact that the Limits to Growth study had a lot of truth to it? A whole lot.
Ignorance is bliss, so I say yes. I mean, you can have so many people just keep blindly doing what they're doing, just toe the line and keep going, and just ignore some of these larger problems around them. Maybe because it doesn't directly affect them. That's another reason, too. A lot of people will most likely speak out against problems or voice their opinions more so if it especially directly affects them. Unfortunately, if it's affecting, let's say, with rising sea levels, people that are living in Polynesia or whatever.
Maybe like a global pandemic, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. They'll be less likely to devote time and just care for it because it's the other side of the world. That's not going to happen to me. That's not the right way of looking about things, but I have a feeling a lot of people sometimes take that, I guess, trajectory when trying to deal with these larger problems. If it's not happening to me, it's not happening, don't need to worry about it. Unfortunately.
Do you think that the rich can escape? You think that they can live good lives over the next 100 years? That they're insulated from the
Some
impacts?
are trying to get to Mars, so they're trying, but I want to say no, but a lot of money can do a lot of things. For good and bad, too. That's another, just a little caveat in there. I want to say ultimately no, but maybe they can delay the inevitable as long as possible with whatever money they have. So
let's include the American middle class among the rich, because we are definitely in the richest billion people in the world. Will we escape? Will we be able to live pretty much untouched?
Just in the last 3 to 5 years, this is, not major, but it is just something that is so obvious. I have made a lot more money in my little service worker job, but yet my money has gotten me to the same place. And I was talking to my mom and I was like, what the heck? Why do I feel like last year, groceries got me, $100 for groceries got me way more groceries than this year. And she's like, every single year you were it's exponential, truly. The 25-cent Dollar Tree, that is a massive exponential growth that does affect not only middle class, but lower middle class, who are still among, higher ranks when it comes to global populations. So we're seeing it even in a couple years. And so I feel like we'll never be able to return back to the pandemic normal. We'll be completely changed forever as a population, I think. So anywhere we go is just going to be constant recovery from the last disaster. And the amount of disasters we're seeing every single day are just, I feel unprecedented.
This is a graphic from my documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth, which is a kind of a fancied up, colorized version of the business as usual scenario from the Limits to Growth study. So I want to pass that around just to refresh everybody's memory. Let's talk big picture for a minute. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to interject while they pass around that diagram. Dave asked you whether the middle class would survive. That's a question of what will really happen. What do you think the middle class thinks about its survival? Do you think that the middle class and up in the United States think it sucks to be in Africa, it sucks to be in Indonesia, but we'll be good? Global warming and climate change disaster, loss of biodiversity, etc., is going to be more of a bummer for them than it is for us, and we're good.
So I actually played the climate fresque with a group of my friends that aren't in environmental science, and essentially the end card
The start card is always human activities. You go through all the consequences of climate change. The last one is usually armed conflict. And the saddest realization any of them had was that as Americans, if the worst consequence of climate change is armed conflict, we will all be fine.
Do you think that's uniform? People just think we are privileged. Let's not kid ourselves. There may be a few in here who are truly came from the bottom, but most of us are relatively privileged, and we'll be fine. And that's sort of why we're not as concerned about this as maybe we should be?
Yeah, I do think it is I was going to say an American superiority, but I think it's a Western or colonizer superiority for sure, that we have been able to use resources and just like walk into other countries and just be untouched and just kill leaders and take resources and take human lives. So like truly we haven't seen enough consequence in our history to scar us enough to realize this. So I think it'll be pretty shocking when the majority of us are affected. I'm hoping that the minority that aren't are not the rich people, but I don't know how we would change that. I really don't.
I think it's happening now, actually, with the Superior Fire, the Marshall Fire recently in Colorado, and also all the wildfires that's been on the news as of recently. A lot of those areas are middle class to rich people. So I feel like the effects of climate change is catching up to them.
Yeah, that was my thinking exactly. Where do you escape from that? No amount of money, really.
Also, the economy is collapsing. Mm-hmm. Let's face it, in 2008, it's ended, actually. We're pretending like it's still surviving, but they have printed a lot of money. And with this pandemic, it's not helping. And there's going to be more inflation, and middle class will get more. It's going to get poorer and poorer every year. So with the climate change effects, I don't think, we can see very good years ahead of us. It's very important and very problematic.
Okay, so we've looked at this business as usual scenario. So big picture, we really don't want to experience that. Of course, we're already in it, but it's a big assumption. But let's assume that maybe it's not too late to really change that trajectory. And I know some of us believe that we can still do that. What do we need to change in order to not go down that scenario?
A complete massive overhaul of the whole entire system as we know it.
Is that all?
Yeah, pretty simple.
Which is a lot harder to imagine, and it kind of has to do with all sectors that is even imaginable nowadays. And a lot of scientific research to even attempt to stop the motions that are already in play.
I really think kind of looking at like natural gas as a starting point, just getting away from our reliance on plastics and then like oil for transportation and our energy sector. Like that is a good starting point because just our reliance on oil in so many different industries is probably the biggest issue.
Yeah, and the plastic is also from the oil, so if we reduce plastic, we have more oil to use. Yeah, and oil can be used in a lot of ways. Maybe we can use like reusable resources, or people need to know how to recycle or reuse those resources.
We also should get legislation, and to do that, we need to elect people in Congress and in government that actually believe in climate and actually do something in climate, for the climate, and for all these problems that we're having.
And on top of that, I was going to say, we had a class where we talked about this. We as individuals can kind of do all we want, but it's not going to change until like the leaders will do something so that the systems are set in place. So like we don't have to spend more money to change. It's actually like cheaper to change.
Well, and I think so much content, especially that came out earlier when kind of millennials were taking on in the workforce, and even Gen Z, so much news and was just about how like bogged down we are by the workforce and like how hopeless our economic system looks for us and like how many student loans we have and just like how we'll always be unpaid interns. And like there's so much crap about that, about both millennials and Gen Z, and I really do believe it exist to keep us complacent within these industries and like not want to move upwards and not challenge the boomer CEO that has been in his seat for 40 years. And so I'm hoping that people just become bold when we start to take on these issues, because we're armed with a crap ton of information and a lot of people, because I mean, social media, it tells us we have so many people in solidarity with this issue, specifically within our generation. And so I'm hoping that that inspires a lot of work as we become workers.
Yeah, plus probably education and the spreading of information in its correct form. Because a while back, I do know that quite a few not climate scientists or dead scientists signed a climate report that was the complete opposite of the actual like climate report that looked like nearly identical and basically spread false information. I feel like we're kind of in the era of an information war where every little piece of information is quite vital.
Okay, Angie, we need to hear from the future economists.
Yes, and I was going to bring a whole, like, maybe less optimistic perspective to this, but I think that the way that the world is right now, it's all numbers. We're numbers for the workforce. That's going to translate into money. That's going to be translating into how we produce outcomes in the economy. But when we take that into consideration, we're also consumers. And with that in consideration, you're also considering like, well, if we don't have enough to eat, how are we going to be a productive workforce? If we don't have shelter, how are we going to be a productive workforce? Which is when I think it's so important to start considering fund services that are, and putting those numbers and the price tags into the services that like bees put into like our agriculture system, or that mangroves put into keeping us safe, because we cannot be a productive workforce for the economy if our basic necessities are at stake. And that's what the climate is putting forward. And as soon as we get economists to see those numbers and the impacts that that will have on us, that's how I think that we can start having those conversations more effectively.
I totally agree with that. I love this class, and I love that perspective too, because it really is, unfortunately, the only way. You can't appeal to the heart anymore. We've tried to kind of talk about even the science of things, but really at the end of the day, climate change is unsustainable financially. Like, GDP cannot exist and grow if we have no climate to price and to sell. So yeah, I love it. I'm like, whatever works. If that's going to get them on board, sure.
I think that's a good like selling point for getting like the economists to come around to the fact that we need to like make sustainable change in order to, you know, be financially stable going forward. But then like the other side of that too is that we're talking about, okay, like we as a collective need to like start thinking about climate change more. But it's like going back to that, like what Angie was mentioning is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like, okay, we want to think about this big global issue about like climate change and like standing up for these things. But like, I can't even feed myself. So why would I worry about climate change? Like, why is that my responsibility? And I feel like that's a lot of the pressure that Gen Z is feeling going into this issue is like, why does it have to be me? I just got out of college. I have all these student loans. Like, why is it my responsibility to handle this big issue when I can't even find a job? I can't find a place to stay. I can't eat. So I think like that's the other side of that point. We want everybody to get involved in this, and we're going to need a lot of people to be passionate about this, but it's going to be hard given the current economics like status of everybody.
Do you think how you vote will make a difference? Is that a part of it? Guess not.
I think that a lot of the things that we try to control are not up for things that we vote for. Unless, yes, we can put control on corporations, but the power of corporations right now that they have over everything is really what has the impact. So I guess it's more of like infiltrating that will make the difference, in my opinion.
And we've seen it. Like, we've had some really successful boycotts. The Kellogg's boycott was very successful. And, you know, it's so hard to ask consumers to boycott at an individual level, especially I personally do my best to boycott Amazon entirely, but it is so freaking impossible. Everything you click on online takes you right to Amazon. I was on like the official, I wanted candy hearts for Valentine's Day. I was on the official Barack's website, click to buy, it takes me right to Amazon. I was like, what, you don't have a supplier? Like I can't just buy from you? So yeah, it's so hard to like vote with our pocketbooks, vote, and then when your politicians are being paid by corporations, you can't ask them to not be when every single one of them are, until it's Bernie Sanders.
Katie, it looked like you were about to say something.
I was just going back to like what you were saying, like if we're too focused on like buying a house and paying off our student loans, like how do we try and get like the good job that we actually care about rather than just making money? And I think that's something that like jumping way back to like our parents' generation, like when I talk to my parents, they just have like this optimism about our generation, like your generation will save us, like everyone's on it, like you all are on the same page. And I think that just like stresses me out. Like I'm so happy that they like are aware of climate change and like think it's very important, but at least when I talk to my parents, it's just like this optimism for our generation, which is just like unrealistic, I feel, based on like the world we're entering, and honestly like pretty unfair.
I do have a bleak opinion, or I do think that as we start to inherit some wealth, maybe we'll start to like see more positive change. R.I.P. Grandma. But I do think that like there is so much hoarding of wealth. It's not, I know, like statistically we don't have any money, and millennials don't have any money either, and they're like 45. Like it's kind of crazy. So I'm hoping that more people start to like invest in things that make sense for the world.
I guess going back to voting too, as just maybe being a possible way to solve these issues. I mean, people vote based on temperament and then also based on how much it's affecting them financially, realistically. I mean, am I paying more at the pump? Am I paying more for basic necessities? Also at the same time, too, with voting nowadays and just with looking through a political lens, not since really the 1960s have, as a society, we've been so divided with discussing these issues and even talking things out without assuming the worst of one another and just assuming that either one side is just totally ignorant and the other one is just pie in the sky dreams and not living based in reality. And we really have to get over that if we are to solve these issues. We can't view each other through the lens of extremes because most people take the middle route when viewing these issues. So, I mean, that's a really big, I guess, change that needs to happen in terms of politics and really just in terms of just American society, civilians as a whole, is we need to get over viewing the other side as like the enemy or the blockade to progress or to really solving the greater issues that ultimately are going to affect us all in one way or another. And I have a feeling that's going to be one of the bigger, maybe more immediate problems coming forward that'll exacerbate a lot of what we've been talking about or not even solve it to begin with.
I feel like we need to change our thoughts about our environment. Like, I believe a society constructs our think or thoughts. So maybe we can let those people who care for the environment and let them can make some money. Because we have learned about a lot of examples, like we have spent a lot of money on disaster, like tornado. After tornado, we need to spend a lot of money to repair this environment, and that money is a lot more than our whole world GDP. So maybe we should change our thoughts to make some money, like from protecting our world. And maybe people love to care for our environment because they can get benefits on it.
And that's like also just some notion of like, what is one vote in the world of globalization? I think that you can't dismiss the fact that the whole world is interconnected when it comes to climate change. Like, the decisions that I can make here, yes, they have an impact maybe on my county. There's this saying that says, a wise man's saying that if I try to change the world, then I will change nothing. If I change myself, then I could possibly impact my family and so forth. I think that that's possibly something that to take into consideration here, because I feel like it's so easy for us as Americans to say like, oh, we should just like set the example for the rest of the world to act in this way that's more considerate of like the environment. But then how do we say that as also like a developed country to countries who are developing? How is it fair for us to say or to limit their growth? I guess that's something that also needs to be discussed, because yes, we should limit our growth because we had growth, but what do we do about the rest of the world who doesn't necessarily have what we have? And that's just a question that I have for maybe the rest of the table. Sorry for posing it, but it's just something to think about.
It's a great question. Thanks for asking it.
Not right to assume that every country wants to be America either, because a lot of cultures are so different. And I think that like progress to every country looks super different, and that's just such an American, I definitely think that every country like wants the American dream, and I grew up thinking that. And so that is totally a cultural thing to dismantle for sure for us. But like, yeah, I do think it's about literally giving back, like actually reparations for specifically colonialism, but just, I think, maybe our exploitation of countries now, even with globalization, but literally acknowledging and giving back stuff. Like, it's the one thing that people don't want to do. Nobody wants to defund anything. Nobody wants to take something out of their house and give it to their neighbor. But at the end of the day, like, that is right, truly, like, that is equitable. And I don't know, and that might be the way to help bring Americans together, because we are, like, it's so funny because I think Republicans and Democrats are just family people. Like, we're all talking about the same issues. We're talking about the best way to provide for our family, to provide for our community, and to just, like, make sure our kids eat. And then we're just so angry at each other because the people that aren't letting us do that and are taking away that ability for us to provide are the ones pitting us against each other. And so, like, I'm hopeful maybe that, like, if we prioritize Maslow's hierarchy globally, that, like, that brings community and global community change. I don't even know what tangent that was, but...
Well, circling back around to Angie's question, I would like to explore that a little bit and talk about the economy. You know, it might be this year, or if it's not this year, it might be next year, to have maybe a $100 trillion global economy. First of all, can that economy continue to grow? Can we continue to grow the global economy?
Yeah, probably for a few more decades. And then I think we'll get hit like a Mack truck or something. Something's going to happen. It's going to bust.
Well, so should we continue to grow it?
No.
Like, you can type in any numbers you want on a computer or mine any amount of currency you want. It still doesn't, like, provide for human lives. And, like, that is truly the tangible, visual success of the economy. So, like, yeah, one guy could be typing on a computer while the rest of the world burns. Economy at 600 trillion. Like, we did it. It's like, what does that even mean if everyone's dead?
Yeah. GDP isn't a good measure at all of human well-being. In fact, it's probably the best measure of how much destruction we're wreaking on the planet, isn't it? But if you're trying to look at, well, what happens to those of us who overgrew, and what happens or should happen to those who haven't grown nearly as much as us yet, I think there's a pretty big school of thought out there, not big enough, that believes that the overdeveloped countries, I like to call them, that we have some shrinking to do. We really need to shrink our economy, right? Our GDP, the amount of economic throughput, even though it is a number, but it's the best measure we have of how much material is being extracted and converted into products, et cetera, et cetera. We've got to shrink our global economy and the economies of the nations that haven't overdeveloped yet. I hate to say that they need to grow their economy, because what they really need to do is they really need to have their needs met. They need to have better quality of life, and GDP is a lousy measure of that. But as they improve their quality of life, their GDP is going to go up. So we need to leave them some room for GDP growth. And the only way to do that is for us to shrink ours so that there's no net growth. And in fact, we need to get the global $100 trillion global economy needs to get back down to what? Maybe 50 trillion. Because I think if you look at the data from the Global Footprint Network, we're fast approaching 2 planet living on a global average. Here in the U.S., we're somewhere between 5 and 6 planet living. But globally, we're approaching 2 planet living. So if we could cut the global economy in half, that might be a rough measure of where we need to go to get back into sustainable balance. Does that answer your question, or does that just raise more questions, Angie?
I definitely agree with that, and that's the way that I've been thinking about it. But every time that I've meant maybe just shrink our economy, that's met with so much resentment and so much attacks. And I'm like, I can defend it in this perspective, but the moment that you tell somebody who has believed this for so long, who's older, who has more status than you, who has more power than you, then your voice becomes silenced.
Well, and it's so funny because they're not even affected by this. When we're talking about the top 10%, but really the top 1% in America, which is, I'm guessing, nobody at this table. And I'm guessing nobody's even in the 10%. So it's these people are defending a system they're not even benefiting from. It's silly.
And yet, if we don't contract our economy, is there a pleasant way forward?
No.
So that's one of the big things we have to do, is find a way to stop worshiping GDP growth.
And realize that much of our life would be the same if this exponential growth didn't happen. It's just when, I don't know how much, it was 500 billion growth during COVID and some amount of decline for workers. Essentially, billionaires made so much money during the pandemic and workers lost so much money during the pandemic. And right there, just in 2 years, we are seeing so much suffering at the hands of these people that could do so much good for truly global communities.
A hard thing I have wrapping my head around, though, is this concept of zero growth. And I don't know if this is strictly from just GDP, just GNP, whatever. Because when I think growth, I also think innovation. And I think a perfect example of this is just look at how quickly we've been able to develop a vaccine for a global pandemic. And that took tons of money, that took research, that took innovation. And I guess what I'm trying to say is with growth coupled with innovation, I don't think it should be stifled because it could be further utilized to help solve some of these problems, whether it be renewable energy, combating disease, getting more people in the developing world, so to speak, onto some sort of electrical system, new ways of agriculture. So that I just find it hard. What would this look like? Is this even possible? And can it be accomplished? This concept of zero growth.
I can't argue with your admiration for innovation, but how important is economic growth to those things? Do you think those things really depend on economic growth? What's the connection?
I would say they depend on money. I don't know necessarily about... They depend on money. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so I follow a creator on TikTok who owns a business, and she has a socialist business model where she makes zero net profits per year. And the way that she does it is the money that she makes on the product she sells, clothing, she invests it into the company's investments, what you need to invest per year. And she includes her employees' income, and everybody makes the same income. They all make $72,000 a year, including her. And then any profit that they have at the end of the year goes to the company. It's profit sharing entirely. And so they reinvest every year. So I think maybe this model would just be companies, necessary companies that I think I would put food industry, necessary industries operating at a zero profit margin and not exploiting workers and giving equitable wages, I think.
Can that be accomplished at larger scales?
Yeah, I think... I was looking into airlines. I was looking into airlines because I was having such a problem coming back to Colorado in early January. And they're experiencing staffing shortages. And I was like, I feel like they make so much money. or, what are people being paid? And the CEO made like $947 million last year of Southwest or something. And everybody in the industry feels underpaid. So like, I do think just tackling those CEO wages and really high wages first that are like exponentially higher than everybody in the company might be a good place to start at least.
I think there's a problem with the distribution of the funds, starting from the government all the way to private companies. We all should prioritize where to put the money in. In Europe, as far as I know, a lot of cities are encouraging companies to recycle more and innovate more on reuse of the products or used products or waste management. So they are investing on these processes for them to reuse all the waste or most of the waste, and come up with a circular production system so that they can be regenerative and not destructive, and they can still make profits, they can still make money, they can still produce. So it's just the way of working things. It has to change. We need new perspectives in all economies, all fields. It's nothing to do with, then nobody can deny that it would work that way.
Okay, so we're very close to 8 billion people on the planet today. We're living fairly well, fairly high on the hog in the overdeveloped world. Much of the world is not living decent lives today. Can the planet support 8 billion people living decent lives? Is there a way to organize ourselves so that 8 billion people can live decent lives and we aren't subtracting from the planet's ability to meet our needs year after year?
I would question, what do you mean by decent? And also, just to add on to that, maybe to cut back on unnecessary consumerism on products that really we don't need to improve our lives. How many iPhones are we on right now, for example? Or just useless stuff that you see all the time and just ads so just cutting back on that. And then, ultimately, what does decent mean for each person? And I think that's a quality of life question, and I think it's very hard to really pin down and for, I think, broader populations just because of how many people have a very different outlook on what that could look like, maybe. So I guess, that's where I would start, just kind of prying into that.
Same thing goes to government. I'm going to ask this question. Does America really need that big of a military? A lot of I didn't want to talk about that, but I have to mention there's a lot of expenditures that could be cut easily and returned to something valuable for ecology and human well-being.
I think that just shows a flaw in the business model a lot. I think that a lot of the times corporations spend a lot of time planning for uncertainty. That's why they invest their money in certain ways or just hold off or hoard that money for a while so that they can prepare when shit hits the fan, for lack of nicer terms. But if anything that the pandemic has shown us is that everybody's still going to be unprepared. Regardless of how you allocate your resources, there are going to be things that you can't control. And the bigger things that we can't control are what the world does on the natural basis. And when you compare that to military spending, that's also just spending on a what if scenario. Well, the world is not a what if, and I think that that's what economists needs to start thinking.
Yeah, and I think that is a huge reason why we have so much food waste in this country. It's and just so much waste in general of things that are brand new. Oh my God, I worked at the Great Wolf Lodge Corporation. I'm going to say their name. But we would get massive shipments in every single day of garbage products, and 10 to 20% of them would come broken right off the bat, just garbage. Then we would turn on bubble swords and light up wands and crap like that. Half of them wouldn't turn on or would come back broken 30 minutes later. And it's we are just living in a culture of excess is success, and excess means that you are the best and you have one business and one life, when we find the most amount of joy in taking our dogs for a walk and eating dinner with our parents and reading a book and like roasting a marshmallow around a fire and just things that are not excessive. And there has been psychological studies about money doesn't equal success, and at some point you're rich enough, you're not happier. So like we know these things, and yet it seems so hard to change a system around providing for the things that inherently we know as humans.
I mean, pandemic, this COVID-19 is a great example to reflect on like decent life. So you need to have a room for you to quarantine 14 days and proper hygiene, like some social distance, right. So for many of us, we think this is very easy to do this or follow these protocols. But for some people in their country or in America, they don't have a room to protect themselves. Like homeless people, they don't even have a room to quarantine or some proper hygiene, like a soap to wash their hands and cover their mouths or afford the mask fees and a lot of stuff to do. So I think this is the perfect example to reflect what is a decent life.
Right. Yeah, literally. Like I was talking about so much privilege, like just basic human necessities are, I wouldn't even consider that a decent life. I would just consider that a life of dignity. But
it feels like there's a tendency for us to gravitate to fixing pieces of the problem, and there are good pieces that need to be fixed, you know, the overfishing, product life cycle. And I don't think this is a piece. I think this is major, just redefining the American dream. That's probably a big root item, which also speaks to this eliminating frivolous consumption. But are those enough, or is there something bigger that we need to do in order to make the world work?
Are you asking us to finish on communism?
That didn't work either. I mean, some countries have tried it in the 80s. Didn't work either. That's against human psychology as well as capitalism. So we need to, yes, definitely. The answer for your question is yes. Humanity has to do something bigger, work as a united nation altogether. I don't know how to describe that, but bigger legislations, bigger regulations has to be done from the governments of different nations. And there are also very unprivileged nations out there in the world. It should be comprehensive, not only for Europe or North America. It should be involving everybody. Nobody should be left behind. But it's not easy. So I'm thinking if we start from as small communities, we can start from there and we can make it a big movement. A city can do a lot of things which would influence other cities, and that would influence the whole state and the other states and the whole country and then the other countries. That's what I believe, because it should be awesome if all the governments come together, make these regulations and legislations and put them in order and make all the companies obey that rules. But it's not happening ever since the 90s. I mean, I'm aware since 90s, but it's been there since 70s. So only a little has been done. Apparently, we're not going to be as fast as the destruction we're making. So we can start with small, like this group, for example, can do a lot of things. If we influence 4 people each, it might change the whole city and then the whole county, state. That's what I believe.
I just wanted to say that I agree with everyone here, but I think a big problem is the fact that these more developed countries are hoarding these resources, and instead of helping with other underdeveloped countries, they're just letting them get the negative consequences from the developed countries' actions. We need to fix that.
Change the perceived value of GDP. And with those economic terms, I want to say that I think it's so important that we get economists on these conversations too, because as soon as we can start using economic models, we've used economic models to push agendas forward. Why can't we use economic models like limits to growth? It's using economic models to push this forward. But as long as we continue to use that, like I think you can use economic models to change what's valuable. And if we change what we perceived as valuable, like high GDPs, then we're also setting up the stage for impacts.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think like that's the one place this issue and these ideas haven't penetrated yet is limiting the economic growth. And I think like it's really easy to dismiss these ideas because it's not the dominant conversation being had, and it's not the most important thing that our governments are prioritizing. Like, it's so funny. I mean, you can listen to like a bill or a piece of policy like being argued, and economic growth is legitimate every single time. And building the economy is legitimate every single time. And never are there any descriptions about how it would impact the actual landscape of humanity or the way that society operates. It's just like, oh, growth, cool. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, it's like the unquestioned holy grail. Never questioned, never questioned. You said it's easy to dismiss this more enlightened thinking, and for 50 years it's been largely dismissed. Did those of you who reported on behavioral economics, did you guys stumble across anything that might explain why for 50 years we've been dismissing this?
I just think that the economic models that we're using are wrong in so many ways, and they're not accurately predicting how people will interact in the real marketplace, and they're not correctly predicting our economic growth. They're not taking into account so many of these ecological factors. And I just think they have so much power in the government just as economics, but they're getting everything wrong that they can.
Yeah, and another one is confirmation bias, because people have confirmation bias is a concept you tend to believe what you think, and it's usually a bias. So like people usually think environment is not important to us because those environment, climate change, and like a lot of environmental problems are not happen in our generation, so we can ignore. And so this is a confirmation bias for us, so we just believe the earth will not die, so we can still live here. And we tend to believe this bias. It's happening. We can see pandemic and the wildfire and some African country, Ebola and cholera. These things are happening right now, so we cannot ignore these things. It's like confirmation bias for us.
I think it's a collective action crisis, and it has and it continues to be. Unless everyone or a majority of people take action, there's no benefit or reason for me or a country to take action first. There isn't an incentive for them unless everyone agrees to do it, and that's obviously not how global politics work.
Right, like you would never go down the street to pay for like $10 ethically sourced groceries versus $2 non-ethically sourced groceries. You are going to the $2, like, because as everyone else is going to go to the $2, there's no benefit for you to invest in the environment as an individual. But if corporations do it, and that's the only option, no one's complaining. Everyone's like, cool, nice. It's ethically sourced.
Well, Matt and Melissa, I don't think this was your intention, but somebody listening to this might get the impression that you're basically saying that we aren't wired to do the right thing unless there's some economic benefit. I think you're describing a way that we behave against our interests, but you're not really saying that there's no reason for us.
I think that with the means, if that is your belief system, totally you will. And like my parents are, I have talked about this thing, so they are willing to go local and buy more organic stuff, and they didn't buy from Amazon for Christmas. So, they are listening because they do have the means and the ability to, but as we've been talking about, if you are in a situation where your needs are not being met, what is the incentive? And so it's not the responsibility of people whose needs aren't being met to do the right thing when they're just trying to survive. When the right thing has been taken from them, when the best option, the ethical option, has been ripped away by thousands of years of colonization, truly. So, I think people do want to do the right thing. I think that is a fair thing to take from that. But I think in desperate times, people want to survive first, which is valid.
It's hard to do the right thing.
Yeah. especially when there are no options, when, you have to buy a car to get anywhere in America, it feels like, and you have to buy oil unless you really want to invest in that Tesla, which is, again, a major investment. And it's like, it's a lot of money to be a good person. It really is.
I think humans are innately irrational, especially when it comes to large-scale issues. There's been studies that show that humans can't really comprehend anything larger than the number 70, which is really small. Like if you're imagine 1,000 chickens, that in my head doesn't look different than 2,000 chickens. I can't. And I think that that's at the core of a lot of why climate change is one of the most challenging issues that we face at the moment, is we at a kind of baseline level can't comprehend how truly immense this issue is. And I think that is the driving force behind our actions isn't huge numbers, large scale, universal, existential kind of perspective. It's what's going to feed me. My stomach is hungry. And
Yeah, I think a couple of things that have worked against us on climate change is, one, the change has been pretty slow. We tend to compare this year to last year. We don't compare this year to 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. And also a lot of it so far has been out of sight, other than the Marshall Fire right in our backyard. That suddenly was right here in front of us and harder to ignore. But a lot of it's out of sight. So it makes it hard for us to do the right thing, I think.
I just want to say that people, they want to do what's best for them and not what's in the best interest in a cooperative mindset. And the thing is, the best interest would be to combat climate change and work together on this. But they can't do that if they don't have the money or the means. So they're only doing what's in the best interest of them, and that's surviving.
I think we do have the best social study, though, in front of us, which is the fact that not everybody did the right thing with COVID, and not everyone was or is a good person about the pandemic. And so, I think 10 years ago, if you would have posed the question, global pandemic, how do you think people would act? I think we would all be like, come together, community, wear a mask, get vaccinated. Yeah, why not trust science? Absolutely, why would you not? And then we saw it real world, and that was not how this went down at all. So it is kind of sad, and I hate to have this evidence in front of us, but I feel like when people feel like their ethics are being questioned, they double down on them. And so this has pushed people to become more extreme in unethical views in a way that maybe they wouldn't have even fundamentally gone there had this pandemic not existed. So hopefully the majority of people are still good. And I think we are. We're mostly vaccinated. We're all vaccinated.
I hope so. But it feels like we had a role model that made it okay to be selfish. That made it okay to be ignorant.
Well, and he's one of many. He's got friends, and they've been running the American culture and American economy for years. So the fact that he became president now was not shocking, because it was just decades of kind of accumulation of American selfishness, I think.
Let's go back to behavioral economics, shall we? I think this all just shows the prisoner's dilemma. This is exactly what it is, what you mentioned. And earlier when Juanlin described confirmation bias, confirmation bias looked at it from a smaller and smaller perspective, and things constantly confirming it's not that bad, keeps you in that prison. So you don't, like you said, you didn't know how bad it was going to be until you saw it. So that's what this is. And if anyone wants to expand on that.
Well, refresh my memory. I've forgotten what exactly the prisoner's dilemma is. Can you give us a brief refresher course? Or me? I'm the only one who needs it,
Sure,
probably.
on midterms on Wednesday. So, so the prisoner's dilemma is essentially, let's say you have two contestants in a game. You tell one of them that you are going to give them $50 and they can choose how much to allocate with the other person. You don't tell the other person that you're choosing how much you are going to allocate to it. And that person's like, oh, here you go, here's $1. And then that person's happy because they earned the $1. But then as soon as they learned that the person kept the other 49, then there's that resentment and that acknowledgement of lack of justice and equity in it.
That's not the prisoner's dilemma.
That is not the prisoner's dilemma.
No, but that is a good little behavioral economics thing. We have this innate sense of justice, right?
Yes.
Prisoner's dilemma, Melissa and I are revolutionaries against a system that is oppressing us, right? And then we get captured by the police state, right? And then we get separated, right? And we're told, If you rat on Melissa, you'll only get a year and she'll get 50 years. And if Melissa rats on you and you don't rat on her, then she'll get 1 year and I'll get 50 years. If neither of you rat on each other, you'll only each get 2 years. And if you both rat on each other, you each get 40 years, right? And so you have to trust your other person to get the best collective outcome. You have to trust each other. And the fact of the matter is, when we put people in these situations, they tend to screw each other. Failure of collective action, as Matt said earlier.
I think it's fear of just individual failure, and that is I think biological survival response. And so it's totally fair to I think excuse that tendency, as long as then later you can have that conversation about what you want as a community and what we're all afraid of as individuals, what we all believe is important for ourselves, and that what we need for ourselves to be provided for. And so just being able to have these conversations and forgiving each other when we're a little bit selfish in our needs, but realizing it comes from a place of fear, I think.
I think it also comes from a place of risk. We generally go with the option of lower risk, especially in our day-to-day lives, rather than take a huge chance and lose out or lose everything.
Yeah. To tie that back to the theory that I just kind of explained, what you said, Melissa, I think it's also important to consider that maybe the reason that person chose to take the $49 was because they actually really needed it. So how does that person who earns the $1 react to that?
Right. Yeah. And we don't know each other's situations either. And we're so quick to judge that, what if they were facing eviction and they were $48 short? We don't know, truly.
I want to think about kind of wrapping things up, and I sort of asked it, but I think when I did early on, the impression you gave me was that if I asked you, your friends outside of this class, and your conversations with them, are they as aware as you are of these things? And I got the impression that you generally feel like they are. And is that really true, that it's not unique to you in this class because of what you studied to have a real good grasp of the challenges ahead?
I do think that a lot of people are aware of what is going on, but they don't know much about it, as in they don't know how important and how dire the situation is. And they're just oh, we need to do something about it. And they'll give to a cause or something, but they don't know that it's more important than everyone makes it seem to be, and that we need to start doing action right away.
Well, it's funny because I am called intense a lot. Me crazy. Specifically by my mom and my dad. But they just can't really understand why I feel such eco-guilt all the time. Every single aspect of my life, I'm just the first line of defense is how is this going to affect the environment first? And it's just because I'm so afraid that if I don't think like that, I'm going to lose it one day, because the people that have the most amount of authority over the environment don't think like that, clearly. And so I want to make sure that is my first thought. And that does start to seem like that is a lot of my friends' thoughts too, about their clothing, about unnecessary consumer items, about thrifting, little art things, and maybe it is the people that I surround myself with, but, we tend to try to not overconsume. And a huge limitation is our budget, but it really is just because I think that's a constant conversation that our generation is having. And I'm hopeful that that'll just be an automatic kind of mindset and not really a guilt anymore, but instead just a consideration anytime I go out and have to consume.
Well, we must have the same DNA, because I know what you're talking about. I know how you feel.
I was going to say this on the last question. I think most of our generation knows what's going on, not only because we're known to be more socially focused as a generation, but also just we're in an age of technology where information is readily available to us instantly. But I think what it really comes down to is that, kind of going off of what Matt was saying, okay, let's say I have friends that know about this issue, but they're not as passionate about it as me. So then it becomes harder and harder for them to wrap their heads around what exactly it is they should be doing in order to change this very, very complicated issue. And then people are becoming frustrated. Like, I see it on social media all the time. Like, oh, like, what is me recycling going to do? Like, what is me changing my habits going to do? When in reality, it's these big oil corporations and like all of these different organizations that are really driving like the trajectory that we're headed down.
So what should we put on the table? What haven't we talked about?
I think a general broader question, just maybe a summation, is to ask everyone, is there hope? And is there time to make the changes necessary?
The biggest sign of hope is the fact that time is going to keep going, and maybe the generation that, or the people that don't really believe in climate change as much or as passionate about making a change are going to retire and age out of their positions of authority, hopefully, and we start to see more climate-minded, younger people take office and take positions that are important. So we can't deny the passage of time, at least.
I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I have like activist burnout often because there are so many issues in the world that are going on, like right now with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. Like, I am very stressed about it. I hope for the best. I obviously care about women's rights all the time. There are so many issues that we are constantly worried about and working towards addressing. So I guess my question for you guys is, how can we stay strong and support each other with the challenges that we're facing?
I don't know, man.
Yeah, it's hard.
I guess like acknowledging the intersectionality of solutions hopefully is a good thing. Like, I think just global equity and hopefully tackling climate change is gonna start to unravel a lot of other issues, because I think so much of what contributes to climate change is like global inequality and economic inequality. And so I think the intersectionality of perhaps solutions might actually make it less overwhelming. But yeah, no, I agree. And that's why I'm exploring so many different things, and I still haven't really figured out where I'm gonna land.
One big thing that sticks out is I remember, I think it was a couple years ago, there was like a giant clock that was like unveiled in New York City, and it's like how much time we have left before we pass the point of like we can't do anything, we're like done. And like it was dangerously low.
Yeah. And it's almost a novelty at that point. Like, I was like, oh, cool art installation. Thank you, Wall Street. Like, you're the people to do this. What? Like, you're just going to put up a fancy clock and be like, you're all doomed. Good luck. No. Invest. Do something. I don't know.
I have hope from a financial perspective because I have seen a lot of economic reports saying now they're actually starting to have big names say, you can't just ignore this climate thing or this resource depletion, or it's starting to actually impact the people who, in my mind, were always the ones that we needed to impact the most and get them to change. Is it enough? I don't know. But I'm hopeful. I think it was one of the biggest investing firms for retirement funds just kind of stood up to a huge oil company and said, you need to stop promoting these dunces to the CEO board or the board of operations and put some people who have environmental perspectives. And that was the first time someone with that much sway on such a huge economic industry actually stood up for something environmental. So,
yeah, if we have exponential growth of awareness and interest in doing the right thing, then we might be a lot closer to the tipping point that we need to be over. That's a good reason for hope. What should we title this episode of the podcast? You're doomed. Good luck with that. Okay, well, I can't wait to hear your thoughts because, of course, I led the conversation, and so I have a little bit of bias. So I really am anxious to find out, Stephanie, what your impression was.
Yeah, I felt a lot of solidarity with them, and it really reminded me of myself when I was in college studying environmental studies, grappling with a lot of the same issues and topics, and, what do you do as an individual in our larger society to make change? And so I think on the one hand, I felt inspired by the fact that there are these young people that are about to go off into the world and live lives and try and make a difference like I have since I graduated. But it also was a little depressing recognizing that, nothing's changed in the last, I guess I've been out of school for, I think, 12 years. So have we made any progress in that time?
Well, I wonder if one bit of progress is just the level of awareness. I fully expected that many of the students would confess to being pretty shocked at what they had learned, just in the first month in class about the fact that we are in overshoot and the planet is in such dire straits. I thought there'd be more surprise.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the awareness has increased, and those statistics that we cited from the survey of young people at the very beginning of the episode obviously show that young people are aware. They're definitely aware, but it did seem like within this DU class, there was this feeling of kind of not knowing how as individuals they could really change things.
Yeah.
I was really surprised by the sentiment of, well, I'm going to have student loans and I need money to pay those back. And so I'm going to have to go work for a corporation, and just feeling almost like trapped in the current society and the status quo. That was really discouraging for me to hear that was so top of mind for them.
Well, I kind of tend to worry that it's a little bit of denial of how drastic the change is going to be in their lives. It kind of felt to me like they recognize that the situation is pretty dire, but I didn't get the feeling that they recognized that a lot of choices are just not going to be on the table for them.
Yeah, like perhaps in 10 years, their student loans are going to be the last thing on their mind because there's really urgent things, or like their house is burned down, Yeah,
I hope we're wrong about that, but, it's no longer looking like all the elements of the collapse of human civilization are something that we're trying to prevent our grandchildren from experiencing.
Yeah.
It's not that far off.
What were your biggest impressions, like as a summary of your conversation with them?
Well, I thought it was good that they felt like if they did have to, we kind of joked about it being selling out. If they did have to sell out and go to work for the man, that would empower them to change the way the man behaves, And I really do firmly believe that when businesses are run by the next generation who are infinitely more acutely aware and concerned about the health of the planet, that businesses will behave better. So they were right that some change can best be made from the inside.
Yeah, and I think that their point about talking about these issues using the same language, like they kind of talked about how can we describe ecosystem services in a way that economists care about. They had this idea that you could convince people and economists and leaders by telling them, like, what is the impact to the bottom line that climate change might have, for example. So kind of adapting to the cultural norms in order to get their message across.
I thought it was interesting. I fully expected that in any class like this, there would be at least one or two or three skeptics. And there was, I don't know if you picked up on that, but there was a very bright gentleman named Cody who chimed in a few times, kind of expressing some doubts about some of the things that we were talking about and wanting to maybe focus on just, he was a gentleman who brought up fisheries. We need to change the fishing industry. I just felt like he was, almost being an apologist for the system and just looking for a few tweaks. I don't think he was convinced that we needed a system-wide change. Did you pick up on that?
No, I don't think that came through as a listener.
I've definitely wanted to bring up the idea of overpopulation because I'm kind of disappointed we didn't discuss it. It really only came up when Melissa, who was one of the most vocal people in the conversation and really passionate and pretty intelligent and knowledgeable too, she dismissed it. Because she talked about we're wasting so much food, it's kind of hard to become concerned about overpopulation's role and hunger. And because I wanted to listen to them, I did not want to be doing a bunch of the talking, so I chose not to debate her about that. I think you could probably tell I tried to bring it up a few times, or at least mentioned it.
Yeah, I noticed that. You specifically asked them, can 8 billion people live sustainably on this planet? And immediately the conversation went to consumption. It went to, we need to go with less. We need to stop making all of these crap goods that are sort of throwaway goods. And no one seemed to be engaging with that topic at all. So I wonder if that's not something that they learn about in this particular course. I know Paul Sutton is, very up to speed on the topic of population.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he talks about it in his other courses, but maybe it's not as big of a factor in this one.
Yeah, or maybe they haven't gotten to it yet. Or maybe, it could be that even in this younger generation that there's still some level of discomfort in discussing the subject. Obviously, there's a lot of evidence out there that there's less discomfort today than there was a decade ago. And there might also be this sense that a lot of people have, which is that we're in an emergency and we're looking for things we can do over the next 10 years, and addressing population is not something where you will see huge immediate results. I think that's a little bit of a misassumption because we add 80 million people to the planet every year. If we added one person instead of 80 million next year, that would be an immediate drop in carbon dioxide emitters.
That's very true. Looking back at the statistic we read out at the beginning of this episode, 39% of those young people are hesitant to have children. I do wonder what percentage of those folks, is it because they are worried about the quality of life of their children, or are they aware that overpopulation is is the cause of a lot of these problems, and they want to help address that by kind of being part of the solution? It would be interesting to kind of understand the way that people who are hesitant to have children are approaching it. Are they aware?
It would have been nice to have used this class as an example, a microcosm of that, and gotten their feeling about it, but we didn't get into that subject. But what's your sense of it, Stephanie? What's your sense of the predominant reasoning behind the reluctance to bring children into the world today?
My guess, and this is just a gut feeling, I guess, is that it's more about the quality of life. Like, there's this sort of climate anxiety and this sense that we're headed toward a really different life on this planet. And is that a world in which I want my children to grow up? Because it's going to be hard. It's going to be filled with climate disasters and fighting over resources and famine and all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. I think that kind of really grips at your heart in a personal way, and it goes back to this individual versus systemic action. And that was one of the most surprising things from this group, was like, it really seemed like they felt powerless as individuals, that it really needed to be a systemic thing. And I think you asked them at one point about like electing politicians that would help move the needle, and they all laughed. Like, they obviously don't trust that the political system in the US can really do the right thing and represent the true needs of the people.
Yeah, just electing enlightened people who care and want to do the right thing isn't going to do the trick, because they're corrupted before they walk in the door. They're corrupted by the campaign process. Perhaps they're that enlightened about that. I really did hope to kind of get a short list of, a prescription from them for what needs to happen. And I was a little frustrated. I never could really keep everybody focused on that, and everybody kept on kind of getting a little bit further into the weeds. Really great conversation, and it was a good conversation to have, but I almost wish that I had walked up to a whiteboard and said, okay, here's a 1, here's a 2, here's a 3. What are the top things that need to happen? Because I didn't feel like we walked away with that list.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I really liked the conversation about collective action, that it's a collective action problem, and they talked about the prisoner's dilemma. And I thought that was really poignant, because the prisoner's dilemma could have been solved by the two prisoners being able to communicate, being able to work together to find a solution that was the best and most equitable. And I think that the Conference of the Parties is that, right? It's all of these countries coming together to try and figure out, how do we solve this? But the main problem right now is, the US, we have a commitment that we've made in this global conversation. But then when it comes down to brass tacks, doing something, enacting legislation, regulations, rules, within the US, we're so politically divided. We can't get that done. We can't actually do anything. And so when you think about the US's role in emissions and overshoot in general, if we don't do something, I think, we're screwed.
Yeah.
So
one of my big frustrations in the whole public dialogue around that, about, some of the skeptics of the level of action that really needs to be taken, they say, well, China's not going to do it. We're getting screwed if we do the hard work and China doesn't. Well, you know what? If we don't do the hard work, we're just dead.
Yeah.
It's always good to be thinking of good diplomacy, good bargaining power to try to get every nation to do what's right. But I can't help but think that if every nation just said, let's just do the right thing, we're responsible for what we do, then we just wouldn't have that problem, because it's just suicidal to say, well, I'm not going to do it if you're not going to do it. That's childish.
Yeah. What I'm saying is even more basic than that. Like, we made a commitment at this global conference, and we can't even follow through on that because we have a collective action problem within our country.
I think the main reason that we can't follow through on that is because we're addicted to economic growth.
Yeah, that's the psychological root of it, for sure.
Yeah, we're still not willing to take that off the table. Whatever we do, we have to do something that doesn't slow down the robust economy. And that's pretty much the case around the world. Did this conversation with this class give you more confidence or less confidence about your future? Or is that even a fair question to ask?
I think the way I would describe myself today is I'm suffering from climate and eco-anxiety. I definitely try to see hopeful moments, and I really did love hearing all of these voices of these young people that are grappling with the same things that I grapple with day to day. That made me feel a lot less alone in this, but it does oftentimes feel sort of insurmountable, the level of change that's needed, and how do we get there? How do we influence that? How do we spread this awareness to everybody?
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, yeah, I don't think conversations like that have a big impact on my confidence in the future, or even my optimism, or even my hope, because I express this almost daily in conversations with other activists. My only hope really is that we are approaching a tipping point, not one of the bad tipping points like methane being released from the Arctic tundra or something like that, but a tipping point to where all of a sudden the level of alert and agency and willingness to do something accelerates really quickly. The progress that I have observed over the last decade or two is way too slow, but I think that typically happens in a lot of cases. And then all of a sudden, boom, the world changes. And it could be almost overnight. And if it doesn't, then we're doomed, I think. So I don't expect to see the evidence today that we're going to succeed. And yet we could.
Yeah. It's a good perspective.
For whatever that's worth. I don't know.
Keep you going day to day.
A lot of it is, it didn't used to be so personal. I don't know why it is now. Maybe it is because I'm watching you planning to get married, and, that just kind of accentuates and amplifies the fact that you have this whole life ahead of you and you're planning your life. And now suddenly I am more concerned about leaving a healthy planet for you, for my children. Most of the time, my fight for busting growth has been really a lot more general for all the children of the world. It's been more selfless, but now I'm getting a little more selfish for some reason. I want you to have a shot at a decent life, and I worry about that.
Well, thanks, Dad. Nice to have some touchy-feely moments on the podcast.
So anything else?
No, let's talk about recent growth-busting news.
And we've got to do this, even if that makes this episode a little bit on the long side. I've read a piece just recently that was actually published by New Security Beat in mid-January, called Keeping Human Rights in Family Planning Policy as Depopulation Fears Mount, written by Sam Sellers. And I really wanted to bring this to your attention just because you just don't see this kind of coverage in the media. You almost never see it where depopulation panic is called out and where there's a much more informed reporting that doesn't just assume that depopulation is bad news, that it's interrupting our addiction to growth. It's not a perfect piece, but Sam did a good job here of really cataloging a lot of what's going on right now with the fact that I think we've got something like 90 nations where fertility has already dipped below replacement rate. That doesn't mean that their population is already contracting, but that's the first step toward population contracting. And that's a lot of nations. It's getting everyone's attention, and he kind of documents the fact that a lot of that attention is negative and could negatively impact women's rights and reproductive freedom as these nations addicted to growth try their best to get women to start manufacturing more workers and consumers.
Yeah, he definitely sort of had a warning in there about these tactics that remove access to contraceptives and family planning resources as being against this basic human right to control how many children and the spacing of those children that sort of these global leaders agreed to at different conferences. I think he mentioned one that took place in 1968 and one that took place in 1994. So, just being aware and monitoring that these human rights aren't violated in the process of these countries trying to implement pronatalist policies.
Yeah, I was really pleased that he quoted that statement that established and documented what's assumed to be a basic human right. And let me read one of those from one of those conferences. All couples and individuals have the basic right to decide freely and responsibly the number and spacing of their children, and to have the information, education, and means to do so. And I think a lot of times some of that is forgotten. The right to decide freely and responsibly, and also to have the information, education, and means to decide freely and act responsibly. Too many people just assume that this human right is, I can have as many kids as I want and the world be damned.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention the last episode that we did, episode 64, is Parenthood and Entitlement, is a really great conversation that we had with Professor Phil Cafaro about this topic.
Yeah.
And we obviously take this concept a step further and ask the question, what is the right to have children on a planet that is in overshoot, where that decision literally impacts everyone else on the planet and their ability to live and survive.
Yeah.
So that's a good episode to listen to.
So we'll put a link in the show notes, both to this piece and to that episode of the GrowthBusters podcast. And then really impressive was that he gave me some news that I'm so glad to have found out about, and that is that a conference on depopulation was actually held last November in Vienna. We'll put a link in the show notes. A number of the sessions from this conference are available on YouTube. I haven't had a chance to watch them yet, but from looking at the sessions in that conference, it looked to me like there was some good news there, that there was some effort, some at least, to adapt to depopulation rather than to just reverse depopulation. It still seemed like there's a lot of sense that it's almost more a negative than a positive for us to be entering the era where population is going to be beginning to contract. But maybe they're just a bunch of realists who recognize all the challenges to an economic system that's addicted to growth. But anyway, I think it'll be interesting to explore that, and it's great that it's being discussed at that level.
Yeah, I agree.
Another thing I wanted to mention, this just broke my heart, recent news that Thailand, once a really celebrated example of what a national project to reduce birth rates can accomplish, they brought their total fertility rate down from over 5 to 1.2, well below replacement, in less than a couple of decades back in the 70s and 80s, and they did it voluntarily. It was a big positive for the country. So Thailand's always been a poster child for how to do it, that it can be done and how to do it right. And now Thailand is engaged in depopulation panic, and any day now we're going to hear about policies that they're putting on the table to try to boost birth rates. And that makes me sad.
Yeah, this was sort of another standard story with a pronatalist bent. And I thought it was sort of interesting. They interviewed, I think it was just like a random man in Bangkok who talked a lot about joblessness being a huge problem. And so he was saying, like, there's not enough jobs for the people that are already here. Why do we need more people? So that was really interesting. And, the authors didn't dive into that. They didn't dive into any potential negatives of having a large population or so typical one-sided kind of reporting on this.
We both read this story in the Bangkok Post. We'll include a link in the show notes about that. And let's just cross our fingers and hope that the people on the street in Bangkok set the policymakers straight on this. They have a whole lot more common sense about it, which is a shame. And then last on my growth-busting news list is there was this editorial in the Washington Post, and I wasn't even going to read this editorial because it was behind a paywall. Finally, I looked hard enough and I was able to find free access to it, but it's not worth a read. It's an editorial. The U.S. needs more immigrants and more babies. I did want to bring it up mainly because it generated a good response. But the editorial itself just offered the usual depopulation panic. It seems the U.S. Census Bureau found in late December that the U.S. population grew only 0.1% over the year ending on July 1st, 2021, the slowest rate since the founding of the U.S. Census Bureau. I'll just read one quick quote from this bit of depopulation panic. Robust population growth not only provides more workers to sustain the young and the old, more people means more of the intellectual exchange, idea creation, entrepreneurship, and competition that result from people interacting in a free capitalist society. National policy should promote vigorous population expansion. You have got to be kidding me. How can anyone who has a job on the editorial board of the Washington Post, how can they not know that we are in overshoot and that we need to be embracing and celebrating population contraction? It just boggles my mind.
Yeah. Luckily, they also published a reply. This was by Nanada Bajaj and Kirsten Stade at Population Balance. And they very eloquently take down a lot of those assumptions that you just read in the quote. And one part of their response that really resonated with me was they said, pronatalism and baby bust alarmism ignore the gains in women's empowerment and reproductive autonomy that lead to lower fertility rates. Pronatalism commodifies women, babies, and immigrants as economic inputs that benefit only the corporations that rely on a never-ending supply of workers and consumers for their products. So, yeah, kudos to these women for putting together a very coherent response.
Yeah, bravo. That's a new job for Kirsten, so great to see. She's doing excellent work already. Oh, and there is one more. I think I said that was the last bit of growth-busting news. But Stephanie, I couldn't resist sharing this little bit of news that Jeff Bezos' new $500 million super yacht apparently is too tall to get from the shipyard to the ocean. And this is in Rotterdam. There's a bridge that's no longer in use, but it's still there. And apparently word's gotten out that they're going to be filing an application with the city to temporarily dismantle the bridge so that they can tug the yacht out of the shipyard and get it out to sea and then put the bridge back together. The people of Rotterdam are saying no.
Yeah, there's been some public outcry that has made the city government sort of walk back their promise that they would be up for this bridge dismantling. So I think it's still unresolved whether they'll dismantle the bridge for Jeff Bezos or not. I literally laughed out loud when I read this because apparently on Facebook, some of the locals are organizing an event where I guess if the yacht is allowed to go through, they're going to stand on the shore and throw eggs at it. And I just think that that's so great. Like, we need some David and Goliath type stuff going on here. I mean, what an egomaniac to just assume that they're going to dismantle this bridge for him. It's just mind-boggling.
Well, if that's going to happen, if the eggs are going to be tossed, then I would like to strongly recommend Jeff Bezos, you need to be on the yacht at the time. You need to stand on the bow and proclaim, I'm the king of the world. Because you're trying to be, aren't you? So we've already told you we're skipping listener feedback this episode. We're going to skip Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint in order to keep this from being a 2-hour episode. So I think we're about ready to wrap up. So, as always, you can learn more about these issues at growthbusters.org.
The homepage is also where you can donate or subscribe to our email list.
And if you think this podcast is important, share it. Share it with people you love or just people that you think need to learn about limits to growth. And, you can subscribe to the podcast. It's free on whatever podcast app you use to listen, and that way you won't miss an episode.
And as always, if you haven't seen the documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth, it's easy enough to find. It's now free on YouTube. Share it with a couple friends. Thanks for a great episode, Dad.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks for listening out there in podcast land. Keep growth busting.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.